Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Tristan Rogers. He is a philosopher, author, and teacher. He teaches logic and Latin at Donum Dei Classical Academy in San Francisco. And today we're going to talk about his book, Conservatism, Past and Present, a Philosophical Introduction. There it is. Great. So, Dr. Rogers, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to everyone.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, let me ask you, what motivated you to write a book on conservatism?
Yeah, thanks. So the book really developed out of research I was doing in philosophy on kind of the intersection of virtue ethics and political philosophy, something that's come to be known as virtue politics. So my first book, titled The Authority of Virtue, Institutions and Character in the Good Society. And the basic idea behind that book was that the purpose of politics, the purpose of a political community, going back to Aristotle, as Aristotle argues, is to promote the flourishing of the citizens, is to promote the happiness, let's say, of the citizens. And so in that book, I argued that there's a kind of reciprocal relationship between the citizens of the state. They have to obey the laws and they have to be good citizens, but the state has to promote their flourishing, and not flourishing in a subjective way, but flourishing in an objective way, connected to the virtues of human flourishing and so on. So in that book, I wasn't exactly arguing for a conservative point of view. It wasn't really an ideological book. I was trying to say that both liberal and conservative viewpoints can contribute to the enterprise of human flourishing within a political community. But as I started to work more within the framework, the idea is kind of tilted in a conservative direction, based on this idea that the state has a role in promoting the human good in a kind of substantive sense, which is something that many forms of liberalism will reject in favor of a kind of neutral state, a la John Rawls's liberalism. So I started taking that seriously, and my own kind of political beliefs kind of tended in that direction. And at this time, I just finished my doctoral studies at the University of Arizona in 2017. If you remember, that was kind of a fraught time politically. We just had the Trump election and everything was kind of in chaos. There was a kind of woke revolution going on. And I was trying to get a job in philosophy, and I had these kind of heterodox views that were let's say, not working to my advantage. And I published an essay in the online magazine Quillette at that time called "The Dearth of Conservatives in Academic Philosophy," that was kind of exploring the problem of why there are no conservatives and why it would probably be a good thing if there were conservatives. And so that kind of, planted my flag on the map, let's say, and said, look, I'm a conservative. These are my views. And so I started thinking about these things more intellectually to develop a kind of coherent conservative political philosophy, which really doesn't really exist in the field of academic philosophy outside of a couple of people, the late Roger Scruton, John Keeks, a few other people who are not that prominent, but known among conservatives. And so I thought, well, I'm going to take my academic work in this direction and kind of pursue this virtue politics framework and see where it leads in terms of conservative political philosophy. So that was kind of the intellectual background and kind of part of my kind of personal journey, I guess you could say. And so then, of course, the pandemic happened and everything kind of went out of control. And my first book had come out, as I say, The Authority of Virtue, which was based on my dissertation, Virtue Politics. And so I was looking for a new project to start. And I didn't really plan to write on conservatism, but there was this book series that Routledge publishes and titled Why It's Okay. And the basic rationale for the book series was to try to make a philosophical case for the way that ordinary people think and live. And so I looked at that series. I thought, oh, okay, this is cool. I could write a book called "Why It's Okay to Be a Conservative." That would be easy. It was supposed to be kind of a short, accessible series for a general audience. Maybe I could make a name for myself in that way. So I put together this book proposal and kind of quickly, actually, just in like 2 months, basically, just at the end of 2020, and sent it off to the editor. And the editor was enthusiastic about the idea, but he didn't think it was right for the series. But he encouraged me to develop it into a more sort of ambitious project that included not only a history of conservatism, but a kind of theory of conservatism, or a definition of conservatism, and its relevance to the current movements going on within conservatism, which are very much in flux. So I leapt at that opportunity. I thought, okay, great. And I put together this very ambitious proposal that was, much longer than the book ended up being. And so that's how conservatism, past and present, a philosophical introduction was born, I guess.
So, but in the book you focus on philosophical conservatism. What is it, and how does it relate or compare to other forms of conservatism?
Yeah. So one of the biggest problems of writing about conservatism is to say exactly what it is. Many people have tried to define conservatism. It means many different things to many different people in many different places and many different time periods. And so the first task I had was to try to develop a definition or an understanding of conservatism. And so I ended up with this idea that I call philosophical conservatism, which takes a philosophical approach to conservatism, and it consists of kind of three different parts, or three different moves. And the first part, or the first move, is to say that conservatism is really about the search for wisdom, understood in the classical philosophy sense of the love of wisdom, the search for wisdom, the search for the good life, right? The pursuit of the good life within a political community. So it's very much taking Aristotle's ethics, his conception of human flourishing, and thinking about, well, what would that look like in a political context? And the conservative aspect of the search of wisdom for me is that the search for wisdom begins where we are, and it begins from the society that we live in, and it begins from the good things that we already have, and it begins from this impetus, or this disposition to want to conserve those good things and to build the good life out of the good life that we already have, or the good life, or the good things that we already have. And so that's the first aspect of this, is this sense of the search for wisdom, and this aspect that we want to conserve what has value. We want to be attached to the things that we love, a phrase associated with Roger Scruton. So then the question is, well, okay, we want to conserve the things that we have. Well, how do we promote those things? How do we grow in wisdom? How do we forge a conception of happiness and the good life in a community with other people? What does that look like, and how does that relate to the political apparatus of society? Can we really search for wisdom through the government? That's something that sets off alarm bells for certain people. So the second move is to say, well, okay, we're going to conserve the good. We're going to promote the human good in this kind of thick sense, understood as a life of virtue in a community with other people. But that's not a license to install the philosopher kings and impose a conception of the good life from the top in a kind of authoritarian manner. And the reason for that is that the second aspect of philosophical conservatism, as I understand it, is that philosophical conservatism is aware of the limits of human life and the human being. So it's built out of limits that are epistemic limitations on what we can know, and what I call moral limitations, which are limitations on our ability to be moral, basically, right? We have weakness of will, we're hypocrites, we're tempted, we're fallen creatures. And so the search for wisdom has to recognize our epistemic limits and our moral limits. And so the epistemic limits kind of lends weight to the idea of tradition, that we have these systems and practices that have been built up over time, and they have a kind of innate wisdom attached to them. And that should be our kind of starting point for thinking about promoting the good. And then the moral limits lean very heavily on the idea of the rule of law, and the idea that we have to follow the law, and we have to implement changes in society in a way that is consistent with the rule of law and is not radical and is not revolutionary, but works kind of from within the political community. And that leads to the last part of the view, which is, so you might think, okay, we have these limits, and so there's no way to promote the good, right? Because there's nothing we can actually do. And so you might think that leads to a kind of libertarian view where the state just kind of, takes a kind of hands-off approach. So the last part is to say, well, we need a standard of value. We have to know when change is for the better. And in my view, conservatism is not opposed to change, but rather, as Burke argues, change is necessary in order to conserve a society. A society has to be open to change in order to adapt to the circumstances and sustain itself throughout time. So conservatism's standard of value, in my view, is human happiness, is the human good, is a kind of conception of justice, but it's not an ideological or an abstract sense of justice. It's not a theory of justice, but it's a sense of justice that works from within a community, that works from within the existing traditions of a community, of a political community, and it extracts its moral ideas out of that tradition. So this is a theme in the book that I call change from within, or finding justice within tradition. And that's the way to identify and legitimate change that genuinely serves the human good within a political community, without overstepping our limits, and while keeping in mind this idea that we're searching for wisdom together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, later in our conversation, we're also going to get a little bit into more detail when it comes to the tenets of conservatism, the values and ideas associated with it, or at least with certain authors that are or were conservatives themselves. But now I would like to ask you, you mentioned justice there, and in the book you tie conservatism to the virtues of gratitude, humility, and justice. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so those three virtues grow out of the three aspects of philosophical conservatism that I just outlined. So the virtue of gratitude is this idea that we have these good things that have been bequeathed to us, that have been given to us from previous generations. We're born into families. We're born into a system of government. We're born into this tradition. And we should be grateful for those things. And part of the conservative disposition is to acknowledge the things that make the good life possible. So I also talk about these as duties of piety, which traditionally are owed toward your family, toward your community or your political community, and also God. So three aspects of piety there that grow out of the sense of gratitude. So that's the first virtue that I associate with the search for wisdom. The search for wisdom begins with an appreciation for the good things that you already have. And the second one, humility, I connect to this idea of limits. So we should be grateful, and we should try to promote the good, but we should not try to promote the good in a way that exceeds our epistemic and our moral limitations. And part of being aware of those limitations, I think, is to have the virtue of humility, right? We should be intellectually humble. We should not overstate our abilities. We should not think we can install philosopher kings, anything like that. And we also should not think that we're saints, and that every time we try to promote the good, that just because we have good intentions, that things are going to work out well. We should have a kind of tragic sense of the human being and be aware of our limitations in that way. And Socrates is very much the inspiration for the virtue of humility here. This idea that wisdom consists in knowledge of your own ignorance, and I trace that theme through some of the other conservative thinkers in the history of philosophy. So those are the first two virtues: gratitude, humility. And then the third virtue is justice. Justice as a virtue of a person rather than a virtue of a state. So justice understood as somebody who abides by the laws, is interested in promoting the common good, but is only willing to do so in ways that are consistent with the political constitution, in ways that are consistent with the rule of law, is not a radical, is not trying to transform society into their own vision of what justice should be, but rather works for justice from within an existing tradition, and that corresponds to the idea of change from within.
In the book, you also talk about and go through the history of conservatism, particularly through the history of conservative thinkers and authors. And I would like to ask you about that. But just before we get specifically into that, how old is conservatism?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things you have to grapple with when you write about conservatism is that the history really matters, and you have problems of anachronism. So I talk about the ancient philosophers, and many people will say, well, Plato wasn't a conservative because conservatism doesn't come along until much later. So how old is conservatism? Well, the modern ideology of conservatism is usually traced to the 18th century in the response to the French Revolution, of course, in Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, which is not really a political treatise, and it's very particular to its time, and you have to really extract a theory of conservatism out of that book. But more generally, I think the conservative disposition, is as old as human nature. I think everybody has some aspect of the conservative disposition, and some people are more prone to it than others, let's say, psychologically speaking. There's a kind of interesting discussion there about the kind of personalities who tend toward conservatism. So I would trace it to the 18th century, but I think the 18th century ideas of conservatism that are a response to the French Revolution and really the rise of modernity and liberalism more generally, when society really starts to change rapidly, you might think, like, before that happens, there really isn't much of a need for conservatism because things are not really changing, and so there's no real need to defend the status quo, to defend the things that we cherish. But for me, what's distinctive about my view, in some measure, is that I don't begin the story of conservatism in the 18th century, because I think the so-called Enlightenment conservatism, of course, it doesn't come out of nowhere. For me, it really grows out of these ideas that are associated with the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, as well as Christian philosophy. And so for me, it's particular to Western Europe at a particular time that's coming out of these very, very strong intellectual strands. And so I like to think of conservatism as kind of a prehistory, and then the beginning of modern conservatism begins in the 18th century.
So let me ask you a little bit about some of the most ancient conservative thinkers that you mentioned in the book, including Plato and Aristotle. I mean, which of their ideas would you associate or label as conservative?
Yeah, so in the chapter 1 on ancient philosophy, I traced the three themes of philosophical conservatism: the search for wisdom, this idea of limits, and the idea of change from within, through three ancient philosophers: Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero. He's kind of the odd one out, I guess. I don't know. Not many people would say the name of Cicero alongside the names of Plato and Aristotle, but for me, Cicero is an important conservative political philosopher. So all three of those thinkers, I locate this theme of the purpose of politics is the promotion of human flourishing, understood as a life lived in accordance with the virtues. And of course, that just is ancient political philosophy. And I think that is a conservative way of thinking about politics that you find in the ancient philosophers. And I had a background in ancient philosophy. It kind of got me into virtue ethics, and eventually virtue ethics got me into thinking about conservative political philosophy. So that's a theme that all three have in common. More specifically, this idea of limits. So Plato is usually thought of as a kind of radical, right? If you read the Republic, there are all these wild ideas about how to reform society. We should, make property equal. We should, have women participate in ruling, which was totally radical at the time. And of course, the idea of the philosopher kings. I have a different reading of Plato's Republic, which follows some what you might call Straussian readings, which is that when Plato develops the ideal city in the Republic, he's not putting it forward as a serious political proposal. He doesn't think this is what the just city should be, and this is how we should implement the just city. He's putting it forward as a kind of thought experiment. And the thought experiment, the purpose of it, I think, is to teach us that ideal justice is not possible in this world, and that there's no way to achieve the just city. And the reason why we can't achieve the just city is that we're attached to these things, right? We're attached to our families, we're attached to our property, and it's foolish to try to implement these things, politically speaking. And if you read the dialogue, you can kind of get hints that that's what he's up to, because when Socrates introduces the idea of the philosopher kings are what are supposed to get the just city off the ground, right? It's, well, Glaucon and Adeimantus say, how are we going to get this thing off the ground? And Socrates says, well, we can get it off the ground with one change, right? One little change. Philosophers have to be kings. You go, oh, wow, that's a big change. And so what I think Socrates is saying there is that, no, we actually can't get this thing off the ground, that the utopian just city is not possible because of these limitations that we face. And of course, you can't get the philosopher kings unless you have the just city, right? But you can only get the just city if you have the philosopher king. So it's a kind of it's a circle that I don't think you can get into. So I see in Plato there a strong sense that we face these epistemic limits and these moral limits. So even if we had the knowledge, even if we could access perfect justice in the way that the philosopher kings are supposed to, you get this sense from the Republic that human beings would screw it up, right? Even if we had the knowledge, even if we had the technical ability, we wouldn't be able to abide by it, right? We wouldn't be able to live by it. Like, maybe you could get the just city off the ground, but it would only last a day or a week or something. Somebody would throw something in the spokes and mess it up. So that's the contribution I see in Plato. You also get very strong arguments in Plato in favor of the rule of law. So Socrates' view in the Crito dialogue that he's going to abide by the order of the court and faces death, even though he thinks it's unjust. He thinks he should follow the laws of the city. You get a strong argument for the rule of law there. Another dialogue, The Statesman, I discuss, where a similar argument is given that even if you have a terrible state, it's better to obey the laws of a terrible state than to disobey the laws and try to change them, because you'll end up doing more harm than good. So that's the view of Plato. Aristotle, I think, is more straightforwardly a conservative political philosopher, in the sense that he has a conservative method. Aristotle's method in ethics and in politics is to work from what he calls the endoxa, which are kind of opinions that have something to be said about them, things that have some argument for them, that people seem to think, that are ideas that are kind of floating around. Right. And Aristotle wants to look at those and subject them to critical scrutiny and to try to sort of seek the truth out of those ideas. So Aristotle doesn't come along and say everything we think about, ethics and political philosophy is nonsense. We should overturn it, and we should, build up our knowledge from scratch. He thinks, no, we should work from kind of within the societies that we're brought up in. And for that reason, he thinks that habits are very important. A student of ethics and politics has to be brought up in what he calls fine habits. And out of that, we'll develop a sense of justice and the common good, and it's going to allow us to improve society from within, right? And it's going to, we can study political constitutions and understand what works and what doesn't work. And sure, we can have this idea of the best constitution in a kind of ultimate sense, what he calls the constitution that would be naturally just everywhere. But Aristotle, especially in his politics, he's more focused on what works and what works given the particular circumstances that you're dealing with. And so for me, that's a conservative way of thinking about politics, that it doesn't have to be what's best, all things considered, but it's what's best for where we are and what we're working from.
How does conservatism then relate to Christianism, and what kinds of conservative ideas can we find in the philosophy of authors like St. Augustine?
Yeah, so the Christian aspect is what I call the other source of conservative political philosophy. So there's the ancient source, and then there's the Christian source. And of course, that corresponds to how many people think about the Western tradition. There's this, influence of Athens, and then there's this influence of Jerusalem, right? And the marriage of those two things is really what makes the Western tradition. And I share that view, and I think that's in fact what conservatives are trying to conserve. So if the ancient aspect of that is the search for wisdom, what's the Christian aspect? So the subtitle of the chapter 2 on Christian philosophy is the limits of philosophy. And for me, the theme of Christianity is to say that we're not going to do this on our own. The human being cannot achieve the good life by his own efforts, and we cannot achieve good societies by our own effort. Takes our own effort, but it also takes what you might call, the gift of grace. It takes the grace of God to be capable of happiness and to be lucky enough to live in a society that is a good society. So I read Augustine and I see him, criticizing the Stoics, for example, and saying these guys were just arrogant. They were so prideful that they thought they could win happiness by their own efforts alone, that human reason was capable of, sort of winning virtue and being triumphant in that way. And of course, Augustine has this sort of, darker sense of human nature that grows out of his theology. The idea of original sin, of course, is associated with Augustine. Now, once you accept that, okay, we're not going to win this thing on our own. We're not going to save ourselves by our own efforts. That's kind of liberating in some ways, because then you can focus your attention on other things. So in Augustine, I trace three types of limits. The first is the limits of human nature, right? We're fallen creatures, right, marked by sin, and there's no way of overcoming that, right? And that aligns with the second aspect of philosophical conservatism, this idea of epistemic and especially moral limits, right? The idea that even if we could understand perfect justice, we wouldn't be able to implement and abide by it, right? Somebody would, eat the apple in the garden, right? So, something like that would happen to screw things up. So that's the first limit. The second limit has to do with politics. Augustine doesn't really have a political theory, or he has a theology within which you can kind of extract aspects of political theory. Augustine thinks we need a state because people aren't going to be good on their own, and we need coercion to keep people in line. And that authority is actually good because it's been instituted by God. And we're not going to find salvation within the polis, right? The best we can do is to keep peace and to allow a kind of earthly happiness, right? So this is the two cities idea: the earthly city, which is the city that we find ourselves in, the actual city, and then there's the city of God, the heavenly city, and that's really where we should be looking toward virtue and toward obedience and love of God. So the second limit is the limit of politics, right? We're not going to save ourselves in the polis. And then the third limit is of philosophy itself. For Augustine, you can't live a good life without love and worship of the highest good, right? Which for him, of course, is God. And so that's, yeah. So if philosophy can't give you a happy life, it's not going to give you a happy life within a political community. The other half of the Christian chapter is on Aquinas, and it's I think developing more kind of the positive side of the Christian influence. So Augustine gives us the sense of limits and the dark side of human nature, and this idea that we can't save ourselves through philosophy, through reasoning. Aquinas, I think, kind of he revitalizes the Christian political theorizing because he returns to ideas associated with Aristotle, that we can have a kind of mixed constitution and we can pursue the common good. And of course, he develops the idea of natural law that can serve as kind of a standard of value, right? A sense of justice. So that's the second half of the Christian chapter. But for me, Augustine is really the important figure.
Mhm. So moving on now to focusing a little bit more on modern conservatism and keeping in mind the idea of change from within, and that means change from within the character of the existing political order. Tell us about the conservative attitudes or the attitudes by conservative thinkers toward the American Revolution and the French Revolution.
Yeah, so chapter 3 is on Enlightenment conservatism. Conservatism is sometimes thought of as a reaction to the Enlightenment or rejection of the Enlightenment, but as Jerry Muller, someone who wrote a very good anthology on conservatism, has said, um, conservatism is really a movement within the Enlightenment. It's a way of looking at using reason to promote human happiness in a certain kind of way. And what the Enlightenment conservatives provide is a kind of check against this idea that human reason is going to lead to this kind of utopian society, or we could establish a perfect society, establish justice in the way that the French revolutionaries thought that they could. So the Enlightenment thinkers I discuss are David Hume, Edmund Burke, and then there's a final section on some of the thoughts of the American founders from the Federalist Papers. And the contrast I draw between the American and French Revolution is not original to me, but you can find it in most conservatives who talk about these two great events, and you can kind of see what the problem is. So if conservatives are against revolution, of course, conservatism begins with Burke's critique of the French Revolution. Well, how could conservatives support one revolution, the American Revolution, but not support the French Revolution? And the general idea is that the French Revolution was an attempt to destroy. It was an attempt to destroy an existing society and replace it with something better. And the conservative critique of that is that was foolish and caused a lot of misery and pain and destruction. And the people who initiated the French Revolution, were actually just looking for destruction. They weren't actually looking for anything that was good. So that's what you find in Burke with a critique that this is really about overthrowing a society. What's the reason for thinking the American Revolution is any different? So, as I understand it, the American Revolution was an attempt at reform. It was an attempt to take an existing society, roughly British society, which had traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, and to preserve it as it was, right? But to preserve it in a new independent political condition. So it wasn't really trying to destroy; it was trying to separate and establish some form of independence. And if you read Hume and Burke, of course, Burke wrote quite a bit on the American Revolution because he was a participant in it, because he was a member of Parliament. But Hume too has some writings where he discusses the American cause, and Hume actually says that he's American in his principles, which is very interesting. And he thought that the attempt by the British to manage the Americans was just foolish, and it'd be better just to cut losses and move on. So you can see there that, okay, so now does that mean there's a conservative justification for something like the American Revolution anytime a set of subjects feel like they're being persecuted on any grounds? I don't think so. I think the American Revolution was a kind of a rare moment in history where you have these brilliant men come along and try this thing that could have gone spectacularly wrong, and it didn't. So in hindsight, you can give a kind of conservative philosophical defense of it, but unlike some liberal views, I don't think that justifies a kind of right to revolution in general. And conservatives would be, I think, critical of the kind of Lockean reading of the American Revolution, wherein you just have to show that a certain number of grievances have been committed, and then you can launch a revolution. The conservatives are going to be very skeptical of that. They won't rule out revolution, but it's always going to be determinant on the circumstances. And the judgment is not going to rest with any kind of philosophical principle, but it's going to rest with judgment and with prudence. And Hume himself is very strong on this. He says that there's nothing more foolish than to try to develop a philosophical theory of revolution. That almost always good sense and prudence is on the side of sticking with what is already established.
So what kinds of ideas, of conservative ideas, can we find among thinkers of the 19th century? And could you tell us specifically also, I mean, perhaps you can focus on the idea of freedom through authority. What does that mean?
Yeah, so the subtitle of chapter 4 on 19th century is freedom through authority, which is a view associated with Hegel. So there's a kind of dialectic in chapter 4 on 19th century philosophy, which is, I think, it's an attempt to deal with the Enlightenment, right? So in the 19th century, you have kind of the rise of democracy and the rise of what we now would call liberalism, and these things go in tandem. So you have this kind of movement toward greater equality, both in the social and in the political areas and culturally, and then you have greater calls for liberty, right, to be released from various kinds of restraints, the restraints of tradition, the restraints of the church, and so on. And in my reading, this is a kind of reaction against what Burke had called the two great spirits of European civilization, which he called the spirit of the gentleman and the spirit of religion. And those, I think, correspond to these calls for equality and liberty. So the spirit of the gentleman is this idea that we're not equal, that we have these certain kinds of standards that are encapsulated in this idea of the European gentleman who upholds various virtues, right? Which really comes out of the kind of chivalric tradition, and that provides a kind of check on self-interest and so on. And then on the other hand, you have the spirit of religion, which is a check on liberty, which is to say, actually, you can't just live however you want, even if you're not harming other people. We have these duties and obligations that come from God ultimately, and are encapsulated in the church, and the church has a certain role in society to ensure that people are being moral up to a certain extent. And so by the 19th century, these two things are really destroyed. Burke's idea of the gentleman kind of falls by the wayside, and of course the established churches are literally destroyed in the case of the French. And so you have this kind of void of spirit, you might say. And for me, the 19th century is about this idea of spirit, which is very difficult to describe, very difficult to really understand what that is. But for me, it's this idea that a society is not, it's not just a set of principles. It's not just a set of abstract ideas, but a society is a kind of a living thing. It has a soul, it has a spirit, and it unfolds in a certain kind of way that is not really up to the direction of any individual person, much less any individual politician. And so you have to work with that, right? It's like if you're if you're an introvert, let's say, and you're going to, go out and be a salesperson or go out and do something that's very extroverted, you can't just do that. You have to either train yourself or, I don't know, find some other line of work. There's certain things that you just can't go in that direction, right? So things have a kind of motion of their own, I think. And so in the 19th century, you have this kind of, void of spirit in some sense. And so something has to come into the void and fill it. And in the 19th century, what I see are these very strong spirits of modernity. One, a spirit of democracy, and I associate that with Alexis de Tocqueville's work, Democracy in America. And he sees democracy as this kind of inevitable force that's just, it's coming, right? It's coming to Europe, it's coming to the New World, and like you can bury your head in the sand, but it's coming. And the thing that you have to do is to try to deal with that and to try to manage it. And to me, that's a real conservative kind of disposition. Like, okay, this is the way the world is. Let's see if we can manage it. Let's see if we can mitigate, some of its downsides and take advantage of its benefits. So it's the spirit of democracy, spirit of equality, you might call it. And then there's also the spirit of freedom or the spirit of liberty. And I associate that with John Stuart Mill, who of course is no conservative, is really, in some sense, he's the most classic of the classical liberals. And Mill comes along and says, look, we've got this conflict in society between authority and the individual, and nobody's come up with a good idea of how to combine these two things, how to say, here's the domain of society that's reserved to the individual, and here's the domain that's left to society. And Mill comes along and says, well, we have this principle that, people should be free to live how they want, provided they're not harming others. And that's going to tell us that, this is the domain of the individual, and the state should really, butt out unless it's preventing harm to other people. And that's the spirit of liberty. So you take those two together, you have this idea of equality, this idea of liberty. And of course, modern liberalism is usually defined in terms of those two values, the value of liberty and the value of equality. The conservative critique of that is to say that a society is much more than liberty and equality. So one of the thinkers I discussed is this guy James Fitzjames Stephen, who was a utilitarian critic of Mill, and he was a kind of liberal, although he was much more conservative than Mill was. And Stephen writes this book called Liberty, Equality, Fraternity, which of course is the motto of the French Revolution. And he says, look, all these things are good taken in isolation, but they're not ends in themselves. They're supposed to serve something greater. They're supposed to serve something better, right? Like the society is not about just releasing all restraints, right? Because if you did that, you wouldn't have any morality, because morality is really about restraints in one form or another. And same with equality, and same with fraternity. So Stephen thought that we need to think about institutions as restraints on the individual will, and we have to sort of think about institutions, ways to shape them so that we can achieve the common good, so that we can achieve the overall good. And he thinks of institutions as like reservoirs or things that direct water in a certain way. So the water is the liberty, right? It's the freedom to do what you want, and institutions are the waterways that get the water going where it's supposed to go, right? But liberty is not going to tell you where the water is supposed to go by itself. Liberty is a kind of a wild gas, as Burke calls it at one point. So we need institutions to kind of direct people in a certain way, and the way to do that is not to just like give up on this idea that the state should have any role in morality, but to use the state to shape people in a certain kind of way. And Stephen is associated with a view that later comes to be called legal moralism, which is part of this debate in the 20th century between Lord Patrick Devlin and H.L.A. Hart, which is a big debate within legal philosophy. And Patrick Devlin is great. I talk about him in the book a lot too. I got a lot out of reading his Enforcement of Morals. He's kind of a minor figure, but he's important in the book. The last thinker of the 19th century. So we have this problem, right? So there's these spirits: the spirit of liberty, the spirit of equality. Okay, if you unleash those spirits, then it's going to wreak havoc and probably destroy your society. Okay, so we need some authority. We need to allow the spirit of authority to check these two kind of volatile forces. And so we're still left with this question: well, how do you reconcile these two things, right? How do we reconcile freedom and authority? And for me, Hegel is the way to reconcile these two things, because Hegel thinks that true freedom is not you doing whatever you want. True freedom is you living within the society that you inhabit, and to seek freedom through participation in the society. It's to seek freedom through having a family. It's to seek participation and freedom through living in a society, and so on. So he thinks that true freedom has to be won out of what he calls the actual. And it's a very long and complicated argument. I won't be able to do it justice here. But Hegel's idea is that freedom exists in participation in some measure. We're not made free by releasing the restraints. We're made free by committing ourselves to genuinely worthwhile pursuits. And in some ways, I think this is a return to what's sometimes called the ancient conception of liberty, which is that a free person is someone who has responsibilities and has a certain role in the community. It's not someone who just lives how they want as long as they don't harm others. Stephen says at some point about Mill's idea that if Mill's idea was correct, then in the day of judgment, it would be a good plea to come to God and to say, I harmed nobody and I pleased myself, and that would be like sufficient to get you into heaven or something. And Stephen just thinks like that's a crazy idea, like a life is not about that, right? A life is about doing things that are worthwhile and so on. So to sum that up, the 19th century, it's about freedom, but it's about a specific kind of freedom, and it's about a freedom that comes through authority, not in opposition to authority. And so that cuts against these two kind of dominant modern conceptions of liberty as either this kind of negative aspect where I'm just sort of left alone, and also this positive aspect of liberty that the job of the state is to, make sure I have healthcare and to make sure that I, have the things to make me free. It's like, no, you have to win freedom for yourself through participating in the community that you're born into. So that's the way to reconcile, I think, freedom and authority.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to the 20th century, could you tell us about this very interesting split that occurred between the conservatives who embraced economic and social liberalism, like in figures like Friedrich Hayek and Robert Nozick, and I think we can also call them libertarians, at least to some extent, and those who remained faithful to the tenets of traditionalist conservatism, such as Rogers, Scruton?
Yeah, so the last chapter in part 1, Conservatism Past, is on conservative thinkers of the 20th century. The subtitle is a Tradition of Liberty. So in the 20th century, conservatives, it looks like they kind of become liberals because they're trying to defend what are broadly liberal societies, and many of the liberal reforms that were won by people like John Stuart Mill in the 19th century get kind of absorbed, I think, into the conservative tradition. And then, of course, you have the major political global conflicts of the time, Soviet communism and Nazi totalitarianism. So there are these genuine threats to liberty, and conservatives come along and join with liberals in defense of what I call our shared home. And so it looks like conservatives were forced to fight on the side of liberalism to defend what, of course, are genuinely good sources of value. But it looks like maybe conservatives became liberals in the 20th century. At least that's been the read of some people. And I think it's reasonable to say that conservatives are committed to certain aspects of liberalism. If you think that our societies are good and worthy of conserving, then you will think that even the aspects that could be called liberal will be worthy of conservation. But in my view, the fact that there are things about liberal society that are worth conserving does not show that we should be liberals necessarily. Certainly not in any kind of philosophical sense. But nevertheless, in the 20th century, that's kind of how things went. So you have the rise of what now we call classical liberalism, which was an attempt to return to the liberalism of the 19th century, and it's very much a reaction against the sort of more progressive form of liberalism that saw a stronger view for the state in improving people's economic conditions. And so classical liberalism comes against that, but it's really united on the idea of social liberalism, that we should be free from various kinds of social restraints, that people should be free to live how they want, provided they're not harming others in Mill's sense. So in this chapter, I talk about two of the most prominent libertarian or classical liberals in philosophy anyway, and that's Hayek and Robert Nozick. Nozick, who gave the kind of libertarian critique of John Rawls's famous book, A Theory of Justice. And then the more traditional conservatives are Michael Oakeshott, British political thinker, and Roger Scruton, also British. So the dynamic between these two views, I think the traditional conservatives, Oakeshott and Scruton, are really at the heart of conservatism, and the classical liberal is kind of, it's part of the story in the 20th century, but I don't think it's essential to what conservatism is. I think it was a contingent reaction to the various threats that arose out of liberalism on the one hand, and this more modern idea of liberalism as being about economic equality, and also the kind of foreign threats to the liberal order. Scruton in particular his first book on conservatism, titled "The Meaning of Conservatism," which was published in 1980. If you read the preface or the introduction to that book, he says that he wrote that book in order to combat the rise of what he called Thatcherism at the time, which was a movement within the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom to kind of attach the Hayekian or the classical liberal philosophy to the Conservative Party. And indeed, Thatcher is said to have held up, I think Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty. She like held it up at some party meeting and said like, "This is what we believed," and banged it on the table. And Scruton, being a traditional conservative who traces the movement back to Burke, could see that that was not what conservatism was really about. And his critique of that aspect of conservatism in the 20th century is that it really elevated the market above all else, and it elevated economic liberty above all else. And conservatives are in favor of the market, are in favor of capitalism, broadly speaking, but not in any kind of ultimate sense. So conservatives will recognize, kind of in line with Marxists, actually, that there are some real downsides to markets, and markets really disrupt things and cause all kinds of chaos and change. And so we want to be kind of skeptical of the market and use it in order to improve economic growth and to make better lives for people. But we don't want to worship it as some kind of idol. So I see Oakeshott and Scruton as reacting both toward the modern liberals, but also toward the classical liberals who are conservative in one sense. They're conservative in an economic sense, but not really in a social sense. And these divisions, I think, are still with us in some measure. So one thing that comes out of the libertarian movement in the 20th century is the so-called fusionist conservatism, which was a marriage in America between kind of traditional social conservatives, religious conservatives, you might say, that who were opposed to communism in the 1950s and 60s, and the libertarians or free market types. And fusionist conservatism was supposed to kind of blend those two things. So the social conservatives could support the free markets, but not the kind of, libertine lifestyle of the libertarians or the classical liberals. And the classical liberals could say, well, you guys are social conservatives, but at least you support free markets. And of course, both groups were very opposed to communism and the Soviet Empire, and both views were opposed to modern liberalism. So it was a kind of convenient alliance, and it was very successful. It characterizes the Reagan era in America and Thatcher, of course, and it kind of sort of peaks in the 90s, I would say, and then you get a kind of status quo conservative politics, for the 2000s and 2010s, and then of course everything was blown up in 2016 with Trump.
Yes, let's talk then about Trump, about the present of conservatism. That fusionism that you mentioned there that occurred in the 20th century between conservatism or traditional conservatism and libertarianism, how did it eventually transform into the sort of populist, nationalist conservatism associated with Donald Trump and his supporters?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's really the focus of part 2, is to try to connect the ideas of conservatism that are explored in part 1, these philosophical ideas, and say, well, of what relevance do these ideas have in the current moment? What relevance, to what extent is conservatism present connected to conservatism past? And there's good reason to think that they have nothing to do with each other. And the task of the book was to try to say, oh no, actually there's more to it than you think. Like, Donald Trump is no conservative political philosopher, but if you take some of these ideas that are associated with the conservative movement that's going on now seriously, you can trace them in various ways. So how did that story happen? So the story I want to tell, and I don't know how convincing it is, but people more interested in the in the history of American conservatism than I am. We'll have a more thorough story to tell. I'm really interested in the ideas, but as far as the politics go, I think the simplest story is just that the fusionist consensus just failed to conserve anything. This is a view that I think Patrick Deneen has talked about this in Why Liberalism Fails, and in his latest book, Regime Change. Fusionism, it was supposed to be conservative, but it ended up just kind of promoting free markets, which, yeah, that's a good thing. But it didn't really do anything for social conservatives, right? Society got way more liberal, and didn't shrink government or do any of those things that were promised, right? Oh, we're going to get a smaller government. Well, no, that didn't really happen. And so it really just failed to conserve anything that conservatives care about. And so the populist movement, I think, is a reaction to that, to say, look, we voted for you guys, on these platforms. You said you were going to do this, you said you were going to do that, and it hasn't happened, right? You haven't been listening to us. And, we tried to, vote for these kind of respectable people like, Mitt Romney's and the George W. Bushes and the John McCain's and these kind of figures. And they were all useless and they didn't get the job done. So, okay, this big loud guy is going to come along who, okay, he's not a very nice guy and he doesn't really have conservative principles, but he's, going to advocate for us, and he's going to, actually do the things that he says that you guys said you were going to do. And so we'll just go with him. And that has been successful, it seems. And so there's a kind of backlash against the kind of respectable form of politics that was, kind of conservative in manner and conservative in temperament and affect, but not conservative in results. And then the nationalist side, I think, is to say, well, we want to refocus on what we're doing, and we don't want to be involved in all these global conflicts, and we're going to focus on the health of our own societies before we look at other societies. So that's I think the story. It was just, conservatives did a bad job. They didn't do anything they said they were going to do. The conservative electorate really remained, and they saw an opportunity to, hire somebody for the job that was willing to do it and didn't really care what anybody thought, especially didn't care what the media thought or the so-called liberal establishment and so on. And kind of obvious in hindsight, I think. But we're still grappling with this, right? So, every day there's some new thing, the tariffs and the foreign policy and this and that. And I don't know, for conservative, it's supposed to be kind of flexible, right? So it's not supposed to be ideological. It's not supposed to be doctrinaire. It's supposed to be kind of flexible and move with the time. So many conservatives are kind of unsettled by everything that's happened in the last decade or so. But I think, no, it's necessary in some measure. And you have to be very careful. There's reasons to be afraid of populism. But I think ignoring it is worse. So I think populism, it's more of a symptom than a cause of the discontent that we're experiencing in the West.
So in the latter part of your book, you go through several different topics and modern aspects of modern society that conservatives have a say in, or they hold certain attitudes toward them. So let me ask you, I'm not sure if we will have time to go through all of them, but at least let's go through some illustrative examples here. What kinds of attitudes do conservatives hold toward immigration?
Yeah, so in the nationalist chapter, chapter 6, I put forward a kind of conservative view of nationalism that's not ideological. It's really about thinking about the domestic political community prioritizing the interests of citizens over the interests of foreigners. And it's viewing the nation in terms of territory and law rather than ethnicity or religion or anything like that. So it's supposed to be a kind of minimal view of nationalism that's not subject to the kind of objections that people put forward that, oh, this is just, white nationalism or Christian nationalism or whatever kinds of things that people say. And then the big issue that's raised by by the nationalist idea, especially in the current moment. And it's an issue that drives a lot of populism, is the issue of immigration. So there's a fairly long discussion of immigration in chapter 6. And the view I put forward is that conservatives are not opposed to immigration in principle, although I do think that they are opposed to illegal immigration in principle, because illegal immigration is a violation of the rule of law by definition. And so there's a kind of open and shut case against illegal immigration on conservative grounds if you believe in the rule of law. So I explain that argument in chapter 6. On the other side, there's legal immigration, and there you might take different views. I don't think conservatives have to be opposed to legal immigration in principle. In a democratic society, you might think that legal immigration should be determined by what the people want, and it should be decided legislatively. And of course, the problem in America is that the legislature hasn't been able to pass any kind of immigration reform. And so it's been subject to the whims of whatever administration is in charge. So the Biden administration just kind of, didn't bother to enforce the laws. And so we had record numbers of illegal immigration, and now Trump is shutting things down. And so, it just depends on who's in office. Now, even if you have legal immigration, it should still follow the will of the electorate. And if you look at opinion polling in America, and I think this is true in Europe as well, most people want less immigration, even legal immigration. Even if the law is not being broken, people think, the societies it's changing a little too fast, right? There's too many people coming in. It's a strain on social services. This is not the country that I grew up in. Things have changed too quickly. And for years, politicians have just ignored those desires. For one reason or another, whether they like the idea of having more labor come in, or, they're serving all these different interests. And it also just looks like being open to immigration is a good thing, right? We should welcome people. We should be generous. We should, want to help people who are fleeing, catastrophic situations and so on. So the pro immigration side really has, their heart is in the right place, and there's reason to support it. But we have to be prudent about these things. And, if you just open up the doors and let people come in, or maybe even abolish borders, which some libertarians want to do, you're not going to have a country, as President Trump is fond of saying, right? A nation without borders is not a country. So even for the legal side, I think there are reasons that a Democratic electorate might want to slow immigration, or to impose certain kinds of restrictions, to up the requirements for the citizenship exam and so on. And I actually became an American citizen in the course of writing this book, so I have some knowledge of the immigration system. And the civics exam that they make you take is embarrassingly easy and pitiful, and just it should be a lot more difficult than it actually is. And then the last reason, which is connected, you might think, well, why would Democratic electorates have these desires? There's economic and cultural reasons why you might oppose even legal immigration. So it might come at a cost to the domestic labor force. So even if immigration is good in the aggregate, it doesn't follow that just because immigration is good for GDP, that me working some, manufacturing job in the middle of the country might not be good for me. It might cost me a job, even if it's good for the country as a whole. So I think it's not a good idea to ignore those people. And the fact that those people have been ignored is what's driven the populist movement, I think. And then the cultural reasons have to do with just, okay, we're going to let people in legally. Okay, well, who should we let in? I mean, should we let people in who are kind of more like us, who have beliefs that we have? Should we let people in who are, coming from war-torn countries? These things make a difference, because a country is not just an idea, and it's not just a set of laws. A country is made up of the people. And so if you import a bunch of new people into your society and they're different, now your society is different, and it's going to change. So I think it's reasonable to care the kinds of people that you let into the country.
What ideas do conservatives have about the family, and how important is the family as a kind of social unit and institution.
Yeah, so conservatives, and this is in chapter 7 on the family. For conservatives, the family is the most important social institution, and the government exists to serve the family, to protect and serve the family, not the other way around. And now, why is the family the most important social institution? So it's where we're formed morally, right? It's where we develop our ideas. It's how society is passed on from one generation to the next. Provides a secure environment for children, and it exists as its own kind of autonomous society, and is a potential check, let's say, to government power. The conservative view is that all the institutions smaller than the government exist as a kind of counterweight, or a kind of equilibrium of authorities, and the family is the most important one because it's what we're born into, it's what forms us. As I say in the chapter, the family is a place for formation, not a place for freedom. And there's this idea that the family is a kind of restriction on our desires, and the family should really just exist to serve the children, to make them into who they're supposed to be, or whatever the idea is. And the conservative view is, no, the family is there to form you to be fit for the kind of society that you live in. So there has to be a kind of cooperation between the state and the family. And you can see this in education, right? Are the public schools there to form your kids into the kind of citizen that the government wants, or are they there to partner with the families in order to form children in ways that are not antagonistic, right? And you see this conflict all over the place now with the kinds of stuff that's getting taught in the public schools, and conservatives are sounding the alarm about all of that, and rightly so, I think, because in many aspects, the purpose of the public schools seems to be to separate the children from the families in a certain kind of way, and to turn the children against the families in a way that conservatives would say is a kind of act of impiety. So that's the idea of the family. I talk about some other issues in that chapter. So the family is usually associated with social conservatism, which has to do with views about sex and marriage and abortion and so on, so-called family values. So I give some arguments against abortion in that chapter, based on the value of life, right? If we're going to be conservative, if we're going to seek to conserve the good, well, life is among the most important goods, right? It's the source of all goods in some measure. And so the conservative case for abortion is that we should preserve life. We should be grateful for life. We should be open to life in a certain kind of way. We should be opposed to the destruction of life. And of course, abortion is something that gets in the way of the reproduction of society over time because it interferes with the reproduction of children. Of course, birth rates are at record lows, so conservatives have an interest. The state has an interest in people having families and having children, if only to fund the social welfare programs that need taxpayers and so on. So that's kind of the abortion angle of the chapter, and then I give some arguments for traditional marriage as well, and also conservative attitudes about sexual ethics, which I don't know, probably even among conservatives, not everybody is a social conservative in this way. And even if you look at the Trump movement and the populist movement, how much of that movement is really in favor of traditional sexual morality? I mean, I don't know. It's hard to say, but I do think it's core. I do think it's core to the view, and really lies at the center. And even if conservatives win elections, if the family is destroyed, there's not going to be anything left for the politicians to conserve, I think. So I'll just give you a little taste of some of these arguments. The argument for traditional marriage is that marriage is a tradition. It's a custom that's been the same for centuries, and it's foolish to think we could reform it. It serves a certain kind of purpose. Marriage is not just a kind of voluntary arrangement that you might or might not enter into. It's central to human life. It has a certain kind of function to raise children and to provide companionship for the adults. So I give kind of I don't know, an ethical argument for traditional marriage that grows out of some of the conservative thinkers. Hegel has a very good view of the ethical aspect of marriage. And then the traditional conservative sexual ethic, of course, grows out of the view of marriage. What is sex for? What's the purpose of sex? Is it just pleasure? Is it just fun? No, sex is for, right, to make a marital union stronger, and it's also for the production of children. And if that's true, then the moral norms that govern sex are going to be a lot more than just consent. And the reason for that is that sex can't serve its purpose if it's not governed by norms. And the norms have to kind of serve the purpose, not just serve the individuals. And, there's more of a case to be made that the conservative sexual ethic is actually better for the individuals as well, that it actually leads to more long-term happiness. And so some of this is starting to kind of break through. I'm trying to recall her name. I think it's Louise Perry. Louise Perry wrote a book recently against the sexual revolution, kind of on feminist grounds, as I recall. I cite that book in the chapter. And the basic idea is just, look, if we're going to be conservatives and we want to promote happy lives, we want to promote lives of virtue, well, a life of virtue that leaves sexual ethics out of it and thinks that consent is the only thing that matters for sex is not going to be a happy life. Might be happy in the short term, but it's not going to be happy in the long term. So that's kind of the case I give there.
And how do conservatives deal with issues surrounding responsibilities and rights?
Yeah, so this is the last chapter, chapter 10. Kind of falls out of the theme a little bit. So 6 is on nationalism, which looks at kind of the domestic political community. Populism kind of looks at more kind of local issues, economic issues, things like that. The family is focused on the smallest unit, right, of society. There's a chapter on education, which I guess we're going to skip over that, which is on the role of schools in the community. So again, at the local level. And the last chapter is on responsibility. And so there I'm looking at, I'm really trying to answer what's the role of government. And so you might have thought maybe you should have started with that. But for me, those other ways of looking at society from the different levels, from the family, the local community, the national community, that's the right way of thinking about it, I think, from a conservative point of view. So in chapter 10, I talk about the purpose of government, and I want to emphasize the purpose of responsibilities over the purpose of rights. So usually in a lot of liberal political theory, what's the purpose of the government? Well, it's to establish justice. It's to protect people's rights, right? It serves this kind of procedural role. And then within that framework, the debate between the libertarians, let's say, and the liberals is really, well, how big should the government be? And how many things should it do? Should it just protect people's property rights like the libertarians think? Or should it also ensure that people have some kind of minimal level of well-being? And so that's the debate that you saw really in the 20th century between so-called big versus small government. It's really the debate between Rawls and Nozick, as I see it. And I want to just kind of sidestep that debate and say that the purpose of the government is not really how big or small it should be. It should be as big as it needs to be or as small as it needs to be. And that really depends on the circumstances. So in the American context, we have this massive country, and the government's big because it's a big country and it's grown to be big, and it's grown in ways that are not good, let's say, but okay, it has to be sort of proportionate to the size of the country. But the thing that matters is, what's the government doing? What's the purpose of the government? Is the government genuinely serving the common good of the people? It's conceivable that a government could protect everybody's rights, but everybody was miserable and vicious. And there's a line, I'm taking a line out of Rosalind Hursthouse, who's a very good virtue ethicist. And she says, can you imagine a liberal society in which everybody's rights are respected, but everybody is wicked and vicious? Seems like that's perfectly possible. Well, if that's possible, that's a society that respects people's rights, and it's just in a certain sense, but it's certainly not good. And so on my view, the conservative view of the government is a kind of reciprocal relationship which exists between the government and the citizens, and the government is looking out for the well-being of the citizens, and the citizens are performing their obligations that they have to the government. They're following the law. And so the citizens receive rights, but they also have responsibilities in order to sustain the government, and not just the government, but also what I call, following Robert Nisbet, the intermediate institutions, the institutions that lie between the individual and the government. So the church and the school and the family, what's sometimes called civil society. And the conservative view is that the health of the intermediate institutions is what prevents the government from becoming too big or from becoming tyrannical over the individual. And that really grows out of a critique of liberalism that you find in Tocqueville, that Robert Nisbet, who wrote this great book, The Quest for Community, in 1953, drew on Tocqueville to show that actually liberalism, when it releases you from the government, it actually makes the government stronger, because it actually weakens your ties to all of the intermediate institutions. It actually kind of destroys civil society. And so you're freer, but you become perversely more dependent on the state. And so Nisbet says, what the state gives to the individual, it just sort of takes to grow itself. And that's the way in which the social liberalism and economic liberalism sort of work together in order to grow the state. And both come at the cost of the individual on the conservative point of view. And so the way to avoid that from a conservative point of view is to emphasize responsibilities, to not just focus on the state versus the individual, but to look at the intermediate institutions and to see the purpose of the citizen in conjunction to the purpose of government as performing various roles that you have in virtue of being a member of these various institutions.
So I want to ask you just about one more social institution, and then I have one final question before we wrap up our conversation. Mm-hmm. What about religion? How does conservatism relate to religion, and does society need religion?
Yeah. So there are different views you could take on this. Some conservatives, like Michael Oakeshott, for example, seem to not think religion is central to conservatism, that it's valuable, let's say, but not necessary. I think it's necessary in a certain kind of way. And there's kind of two arguments you can give that look like maybe they're in tension, but I think kind of come together. So there's what you might call the skeptical or the empirical argument for religion on conservative grounds, which you see in David Hume, I think, even though he was kind of irreligious himself. You definitely see it in Burke. And this is the idea that society needs religion to serve as a kind of school for forming people, for giving them a sense of responsibility, of a sense that they're accountable or they're subject to some form of judgment that is not just the judgment of their peers and is not just the judgment of the government, but is some kind of higher judgment. So it's a kind of consequentialist or utilitarian justification for religion. Of course, it doesn't say it has to be this religion or that religion, although maybe there has to be a majority religion. So it sees religion as serving a very important social function in coordinating people, in allowing them to be united in the same society, even if they have all these other differences and so on. And it sees religious pluralism as potentially a problem for the unity of the country. So that's the skeptical side. I say skeptical because it's not skeptical of religion, but it's skeptical of this idea that human beings can govern themselves without any kind of metaphysical or spiritual dimension, right? People can't govern themselves by the material world alone, right? We need some sense of the spiritual. The other argument is what you might call the metaphysical argument for religion, which says, no, society needs religion because we have to be oriented toward the highest good and the highest things, and we have to be oriented toward the truth, right? And what conservatives are trying to conserve is the three transcendentals, the true, the good, and the beautiful. And if you exclude religion, you're going to miss at least one of those, and probably all of them in a certain kind of way. And so you see this in Joseph de Maistre, who I discussed in chapter 4, who was a very strong Catholic and a critic of the French Revolution. And he thought that in order to, he says, I'll paraphrase, but he says, in order to conserve all, you must consecrate all. That in order to conserve things, they have to be sacred, right? like, even if you don't think they're sacred, just make them sacred, right? And if you make them sacred, they'll be secure. They'll be less liable to vandalism of one kind or another. So the metaphysical conservative says, no, we should protect these things because they're good, because they're sacred, because they're valuable and they're important. Now, okay, can we protect those things if we don't actually believe in them? Well, probably not. Probably you actually have to believe in order to protect them, right? You can't just say, well, yeah, people should be religious and we should have religions and we should have churches, but, well, I don't have to participate in it, right? I think a lot of conservatives are, I think, tempted to that view, but I think, no, if you think religion is important, you actually have to do it yourself. You can't just be a spokesperson for it. And I think you see that now in some of the intellectual movements toward Christianity, for example. Some intellectuals are starting to kind of come around. You have people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Niall Ferguson, her husband, and of course the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. All these people who are kind of making moves toward religion, at first from a kind of, civilizational point of view. But I think at some point you have to say, well, is this true or is this not true? Right? And if it's not true, then probably it's bad for society, right? But if it is true, then it's good for society.
So finally, how do you look at the future of conservatism?
Yeah, so the last chapter is titled "The Future of Conservatism," and this is not really original to me, I guess, but I like to see conservatism as a kind of a journey through time, and so that's why the book is organized as it is: past, present, and then a final comment at the end on the future of conservatism. So there's this kind of critique that you see, that conservatism is really about a kind of quaint nostalgia or something, right? It's about, reminiscing about the good old days. And, you can watch videos of, look how people dressed in the 1950s. Look how beautiful they looked. It's like, why can't we just go back to that? So this kind of quaint nostalgic idea. There's a great interview that Roger Scruton did with Peter Robinson of the Hoover Institution. And at the end of the interview, Robinson gives him this objection. He says, this all sounds great, Sir Roger, but, this just sounds like Tolkien. This is just like, longing for the Shire. And, what relevance is that now? And how can we conserve when everything's been destroyed? And what does the future look like given that? And Scruton gives this very moving answer where he says, look, we're always on guard against destruction. Things are always falling apart, but there's this kind of call to build, and there's this call to conserve, and there's this call to, even if everything is going to fall apart, like, it doesn't have to fall apart today, right? It doesn't have to fall apart tomorrow. And the purpose of conservatism in the future is just to say, well, this is how we're living. This is how we'd like to continue living. And in order to continue living like this, we have to build. We can't just sort of wish that things were like they were in the past, and we can't just assume that things are going to follow along. So part of conservatism is conserving, part of it is promoting the good, but then there's also this aspect of building, that in order to promote, you can't just talk, right? You can't just write books on, conservative political philosophy and think, okay, I'm going to write this book and everyone's going to see the light and everything's going to come forward. It's like, no, you got to get involved in your community. You got to have a family. You should probably join a church. You should probably get involved in politics at the local level. And that's going to give you a life. It's going to give you a life that's worth living. It's going to give you something to do. It's going to develop your virtue and so on. And you're going to be a better citizen and so on. And it's going to be a journey, and it's going to actually lead somewhere. It's going to cause you to build things. And the idea of the journey, and this is kind of the conservative aspect, right? You're not journeying to some promised land, right? You're not journeying to utopia. That would be one kind of more liberal way of looking at it. We're going to be the change we see in the world, and we're going to change the world for the better, right? And this is what every university website says, right? We're going to build students who make a difference in the world. And the conservative attitude is that, no, the journey is really about building a home. It's about journeying back, right? It's about journeying home to where you should be, right? To where you're meant to be. And it's only in the journeying that you are able to find the home, right? So you journey into the past, right? You understand your tradition, you understand the society that you live in, and then what first seemed alien now seems like it's yours, right? So you make the thing yours, and then you live it in the world. And I wanted to finish the book with this T.S. Eliot poem from the Four Quartets, where he makes this he makes this point in this kind of poetic sense. My publisher said, "Oh, you can't use that because we have to pay the copyright." But he has this idea of the journey home, and the journey leads back to home. And in undertaking the journey, he says, you come to know the place as if for the very first time. And so that's what I see the role of conservatism is, to make us feel at home in the world, to protect against alienation, to build a good life for ourselves, and to hopefully to conserve the good that we have left, and maybe to build it and promote it into the future.
Great. So the book is again Conservatism, Past and Present, a philosophical introduction. Of course, I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Rogers, just before we go, apart from the book, where can people find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, you can find me on x.com, formerly known as twitter.com, Tristan J. Rogers 1, number 1. You could just search for me. I'll pop up there. I'm not spending a lot of time there right now because it's Lent, but trying to limit my social media use. I have a website, tristanjrogers.com, where I have some of my other writings. And you can buy the book on amazon.com or rutledge.com. And I have an academia.edu page as well. You can look that up. There's a link on my website. And of course, you want to send me an email. I always love to get emails. tristanjrogers1@gmail.com.
So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lopez. Pleasure was all mine.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Mark Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.